Hello and welcome to the webinar series. I'm Hui Ling, your host for today. Today's session is titled Improving Research Integrity, Managing and Sharing Research Data, presented by Keith Russell. Keith is the Engagements Manager at the Australian Research Data Commons, engaging with researchers, research organizations, and research infrastructure organizations around Australia to enable researchers to be able to reuse data more often. In this role, he has worked on establishing projects and engagements with a range of organizations, working on policies and the human and technical infrastructure required to make research data more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Today's webinar is expected to last about an hour and will be recorded. The recording will be made available after the session has ended and the link will be emailed to you. As always, we welcome questions from the audience. Please feel free to send through your questions anytime via the Ask a Question button located underneath the main video player. Stay with us till the end of the presentation for the Q&A session. We will be issuing certificate of attendance for participants who join us during the live session. You will receive the certificate details in the post-webinar email. Over to you, Keith, to begin your presentation now.
Great, Huling. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everybody for attending. So I will move on to the first slide. So hopefully you can now see a slide with the Australian Research Data Commons on this. Today I'm going to be talking indeed about, this is always fun when you get these extra little technical challenges to keep you occupied. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the value of managing your research data and how managing your research data can in fact increase the integrity of your research. So I hope you can actually see the slides. I don't have them currently available to me, but okay, great. Thank you, Huling. They're mixing up all technologies to get this to work. So, welcome to this presentation. So today I'll be talking about the value of managing your research data and sharing your research data and how that can actually improve the integrity of your research. So to kick off, I'd like to speak a little bit about the organization that I work for. So I work for the Australian Research Data Commons, and we are a facility that's funded under the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy. So that's called NCRIS. This is a national Australian program of projects which funds a series of projects which deliver research infrastructure which is at a national scale. So think of large pieces of research infrastructure for which it doesn't make sense to run them at a university scale or at one research organization. So think large telescopes, plant phenomics research facilities, very specific high-tech medical research instruments, etc. So there are a range of these projects under this program. The Australian Research Data Commons is one of these projects. So some of these projects are discipline specific and provide facilities that are specific to one discipline. We provide services and support that are available across all disciplines and generic. So our tagline is to support researchers, Australian researchers, to have competitive advantage for their research data. So imagine we try to provide support and advice and services for researchers to share their data and make their data available, but also to have tools and services available and storage to enable researchers to be prepared for that data-intensive future we're all facing now. So that was just to give you a little bit of background around the Australian Research Data Commons and who we are. Today I'd like to talk a bit about managing and sharing of research data and why that is so important. So to start with a recent development, with the coming of the coronavirus and all the upheaval that has caused, we are also seeing a strong realization of the importance of research data to tackle large major challenges that we are all facing. So in the context of the coronavirus and in the context of actual research into the coronavirus, you're seeing a very strong push for sharing of data around the emerging of the coronavirus cases, around development of vaccines, around different treatment technologies, etc. So what we are trying to do, what we are seeing now is a global push to share more of that data that is being developed in research around coronavirus. And as all that research is taking place and all that research is being developed, you're seeing more and more, of course, research articles being published around possible treatment methods, vaccines, etc. However, what we're also seeing, and this is a really interesting development, is when these research articles get published, there is also a push to make not only the findings available, but also the underlying data. So this is a really interesting case where two articles around the use of a specific treatment drug, an anti-malarial treatment drug, were documented in this research article, but when other researchers pushed to see the underlying findings so they could reproduce the findings in the article, it turned out that the data was not available and it was not possible for researchers to reproduce these findings. So this is a really interesting use case, where you find that not having the data available really makes the reproducibility of the research so much harder, and it makes it very challenging. And that has in fact resulted in those two articles being retracted. So this is just one example of why sharing research data is so important. So, but it's not the only one, and this is not something that is novel and only has appeared since coronavirus. This is something that's part of a much larger push that goes back much further. So, if you look back in history, what you see is that there was that concept behind academic research, in that research should be building on earlier research, and you should be standing on the shoulder of those giants to be able to enable you to look beyond the horizon and to see those new ideas building on all the findings and ideas from earlier research. That's one element of building on those earlier data sets. Another push we are seeing increasingly is skepticism around researchers and academic research. With the coming of social media and the push for fake news, and a lot of doubt is being cast around academic findings and research and the validity of research. So there's a number of different studies being out there, and you're seeing an increasing push for people to doubt academic research. So there's a very strong push on researchers to actually provide good evidence for their findings. So this ALIA study is a really interesting example in which you can find that documented. By the way, these slides will all be shared after the webinar, so you can follow the links, and you can follow the links to all these different resources. What we've also seen for several years now is a range of researchers is starting to investigate reproducibility and is there actual reproducibility of research. And this is from a study in 2016 in Nature, in which a series of researchers surveyed a group of researchers, over 1,500 researchers, and asked them, do you think that currently, under the current situation, the current methods, research is reproducible? And you see here an overwhelming, in fact, an alarming majority of researchers saying that it's either reasonably very irreproducible or quite irreproducible. So this is quite an alarming something to be aware of, and you're seeing that there's an increasing push to mitigate that and make sure that research is more reproducible. The reproducibility of research doesn't only hang on data. There are a range of other factors that you also need to take into account. But this article, I think, it's a really interesting example of where you see that often raw data and the raw data underlies the findings in research articles and is therefore so important to have access to that raw data so that you can have a better sense of what the findings are in that research, in the research that is being conducted. And this is an article by an editor-in-chief, that is having lots of manuscripts submitted to him, and he's actually been pushing back on articles that didn't have data sets associated with them and asked, well, can I see the raw data because I want to see if these findings are actually correct. And in some cases, they were not able to supply the data, and those manuscripts were withdrawn. So that does raise questions around the actual integrity of the articles that's being provided. So we're now seeing a range of different stakeholders that are aware of this challenge and are starting to take action on this. So one group, and significant group in this space, is the research funders. So research funders are now starting to push more and more strongly for actually making data available. And this is the data that's been funded through their research. So what you're seeing is that they are pushing for data to be made available, and in a meaningful way, not only to reproduce the findings and to make sure that those findings are properly that have a proper foundation under them, but also to make sure that that research can be built on in further research down the track. And the funders that are involved in this are not just any funders; those are quite significant ones. So that includes funders like the European Commission, NIH, Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also the Australian Research Council is starting to push more and more for making the data available too. Another big stakeholder in this space is the publishers. So you're seeing now that publishers are starting to push more and more for making the data underlying the articles also available. So one of the steps in this was in 2019, Nature and Scientific Data actually set up a requirement that authors of papers in these journals should make their supporting data available. And when I say make the supporting data available, what they're actually pushing for is no longer just to have a table in the article or maybe a supplementary document, but rather to have the data deposited in a specific data repository, so that would enable maximum discoverability and reuse of that data and a proper link to the data set with associated information. And that was just a starting point. Internationally, there was a large project called Enabling Fair Data, and in that project a whole range of different publishers were involved, and they drafted a commitment statement which has since been signed by a range of different stakeholders, including a number of significant publishers like PLOS and Taylor and Francis, Copernicus, and also Wiley. And in this commitment statement, the publishers and the other stakeholders committed to, down the track, making sure that data alongside articles should be published in a trusted data repository. So if we're talking about publishing data, what is actually a valuable way of publishing your research data? And I'd like to provide a little bit of background, a little bit of detail on some recent developments that have happened. So, I just jumped a slide too quickly. I'm going to jump back. So back in 2014, there was a workshop at the Lawrence Center in Leiden, in the Netherlands. And at this workshop, a range of different stakeholders got together, and they discussed and agreed on a set of principles for making data more available. And these are called the FAIR data principles. So they're talking about making data more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And actually under that, a whole range of different principles that would be sort of good practice in this regard. So these principles were then documented in an article in Nature in 2016, and since then have received a lot of international recognition and considered a very valuable way of thinking about this. So they talk about how data can be made more usable, not only to human beings, but also to machines, so that machines can interrogate the data. And the nice thing about the Fair Data Principles is that they're actually technology agnostic. They don't recommend one specific technology solution, but they can be applied across different solutions. It addresses not only the data set and what you need to do with the data set, but also an overlying set of metadata that describes the data set, which provides more context around the data. And the Fair Data Principles are discipline independent, so they can be applied for all disciplines. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, what I won't do here is go into each of the principles and sub-principles in detail and talk about them technically, but what I do want to do is work through a number of steps that you can take as a researcher when you're setting up your research and conducting your research to make sure that down the track you can better publish your data and make sure that you have that underlying set of data alongside your research article. So the first step in this process is thinking ahead, planning ahead. So a number of the research funders are already requiring this, are requiring you to set up a data management plan as you start your research. Some institutions either require it or mandate it or support you and have a template available that you can work through. And these are just a range of different things that are worth considering and addressing, you will need to consider and address through the research project. So it's worth setting up a data management plan. So that will give you a bit of a sense of what are the things you need to think about. So one of these things that you'll need to think about is using community-agreed standard data formats. If you have your data in a format that's understandable to other researchers in your discipline, it just makes it much easier to understand your research findings and what you produced. If you're wondering what are examples of community-agreed standard data formats, please have a look at fairsharing.org. This is an international website which lists all sorts of standards in the way of data standards, but also databases and policies, and it is growing gradually with more and more standards in there. And you can also submit your own standard if there's one that you have. You not only need to think about the standard of your data set, but also of the metadata describing your data set. And there are a range of different metadata standards out there already. If you follow that link, you'll get a whole list of different metadata standards that exist for different disciplines and different data types, etc. As you're building your data, as you're collecting your data off instruments and off different tools, consider capturing choices and settings that you are using on your instrument, for example, calibration settings to collect that data. That will make it much easier for somebody else to understand down the track how you got to your findings and why you came to that data set. As you have collected data and you're starting to compare it, for example, to reference data sets, keep a reference to which reference data set you used with the correct version there. If you use specific tools or software to manipulate the data, remember to keep track of which version of the software you use, because that can also have consequences for the analysis and the outcomes. Also, when you are manipulating data and you're actually preparing it into a form that you could publish down the track, document decisions you've made when manipulating that. And if you, for example, delete outliers, then you should definitely document those sort of decisions so that others can understand why your data looks the way it does and how you got to that. As you are getting to, I skipped a slide there. So back to the findable one. So as you are actually going to make your data findable, as you've come to the end of your research, you want to publish your article, you also want to make that final data set available so other people can find that data set. So for that, you'd want to deposit it in a repository. And if you're wondering where to deposit it, one good place to look is re3data.org. This is a international website listing all sorts of data repositories, and it's worth having a look there and seeing if there's a repository there that either is relevant to your discipline or maybe from your institution or maybe a national one that will be useful for you to use to deposit your data in. The nice thing about read through data, you can also see which of the repositories already have a Core Trust Seal certification. So this is a certification that sort of gives you the guarantee that your data is going to be in a trustworthy place for the coming period. Now, this is a relatively new certification, so don't expect too many to already have this, but this is something that is growing over time. Putting your data in such a repository also has the advantage that you can get a DOI for your data, a digital object identifier for your data. So that means you have a persistent identification where your data sits, and you can get citations for that data set. Putting your data in such a data repository also means you'll be asked, can you provide some rich metadata to describe it so other people can find it, and so that it is well described. Putting your data in such a dataset, also in such a repository, also makes the data accessible. Now, one thing I do want to make quite clear is that in most cases, it's great if the data can be made openly available, but there are cases in which data for very valid reasons cannot be made openly available. Think, for example, where the data contains privacy information or national security information or perhaps commercial interests. And in those cases, you can still make the data accessible. It just won't be open. And a lot of repositories out there will actually allow for mediated access. So it won't provide direct access to the data, but have a mediation mechanism built in somehow. If you do have your data available through mediated access, it is important to also provide a clear description how people can get access to the data and under which criteria. So not just saying, well, contact me and I might give you access, but rather contact me because you need ethics clearance, and you will need this and this ethics clearance to actually be able to use the data. If you make your data available and you don't assign any license to it, it's actually very unclear to a potential reuser of that data what they can do. There's no description there. So for that reason, we recommend assigning a license to your data set. We recommend a Creative Commons CC BY license 4.0 as a good license which will allow for maximum reuse of the data, but also give you attribution as a creator of that data set so that others will cite it and reference it. Now, there's also a few other things to keep in mind. When you publish your data set, consider also publishing supporting information alongside the data. And what that is will depend on your discipline and what common practices in your discipline. But think of things like code books, provenance information, workflows, protocols, maybe syntax that you used in your tool, so that others can understand how you got to the findings and how you got to that final version of your data set. So if you've been listening to this and thinking, where do I start? That's quite a lot of things to think about. Most organizations, most research universities and most research institutions do have a library, and in the library they are often able to help you with research data questions. Sometimes there are also other parts of the organization that have a sort of research data support unit, and they'll be able to provide you with advice and support. Other things to think about is have a look at if there's a journal in which you would like to publish your data. Have a look at what the requirements are from the journal. Do they have a data availability policy? Do they already specify particular repositories in which you should publish your data? Maybe have a chat to your funder. Does your funder have any specific requirements? And have a look if there are any requirements there. If you're looking for a repository, start off maybe looking at relevant discipline repositories that will be relevant to your discipline. Maybe your own local institution has a data repository in which you could deposit it. And if that is not the case, then you can still go to, there's a number of generic repositories out there which will accept all kinds of different types of data, including Figshare, Dryad, Mendeley data, and Zenodo. So if you've been listening to all this and think, yes, yeah, I'm pretty good, I'm already making my data quite fair, in that case, I've got a fun challenge for you. There's a number of fair self-assessment tools out there around the globe. This is one of them. This is one we've developed here at the Australian Research Data Commons. It's a bit of a fun exercise to go through and see, okay, how well am I going on making my data fair? What steps could I make to improve that? So I hope that this was a useful overview and a useful sense of all sorts of steps you can take to manage and share your data to increase the reproducibility of your research. So that was the end of my presentation. So I'll be very interested to hear, are there any questions, somebody would like to raise, or suggestions? So thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for your kind sharing. Let's open the floor to questions for the next 10 minutes. You can click the Ask a Question button located underneath the main video player to enter your questions in the question box. So currently, I have a question with me. So let me read out, and Keith, you can answer from there. So the first question we have is, when should I start thinking about sharing my data?
So I think you should start right at the very outset of your research. If you're starting right at the very start of your project, that's probably the best time to come to agreement and to already start to think about things that you need to put in place. It makes a lot easier to do it right at the start rather than retrospectively doing that right at the end. So, for example, if you do it right at the start, you can also get agreement with your collaborators, other people that are going to be working with you in the project. Perhaps if there are other parties involved, commercial parties involved, you can already get agreement with them around what will be shared and what won't be shared. If you are going to be collecting data, for example, privacy data through surveys, then you can already include that in the consent forms that you wish to share the data for specific purposes under specific arrangements. So those are the sort of things that are much better to arrange right at the very start rather than when you get to the end of your project and then realize, oh dear, and now I've got to go back and try and change all that and try and get agreement around being able to share the data.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Keith, for your answer. So let's move to the next question. Sorry. So the next one that we have is, do data citations not mean I get less citations for my article?
Yeah, sorry, this is something that I touched on only briefly in the presentation. So as I was talking about publishing your data, you can get not only, normally when you publish your article in a journal, you'll get a DOI and citations for the article. Nowadays, you can also publish your data set, and that means it will also get a DOI and it will be also recitable in a repository. So one of the questions we sometimes hear there is researchers that say, well, would that not dilute the actual citations I will get for the research article? And we've seen now as this practice is starting to emerge, that actually that is not the case. And what you're getting is more citations. You're getting not only citations for the article, but you're also getting separate citations for the data. So it's only increased the number of citations. Thank you.
All right. Now, our next question that we have is, can you give some examples on metadata?
Yep. Yes, so there are a range of different metadata standards depending on the discipline you're in, depending on the practice you're using. Some of them are more generic. There are a few out there which are sort of globally generic and used across all sorts of different repositories. Think of things like schema.org that Google Dataset Search uses, or the DCAT, or Dublin Core, or Darwin Core. So these are more generic ones. Sorry, Dublin Core. There are also specific ones for specific disciplines. So Darwin Core is actually a version of Dublin Core that's been developed for environmental sciences. There is an ISO 19115, that is for environmental science and geosciences, and it's great for geospatial information, for example. So there's a whole range of different metadata standards. And if you have a look at the slides, there's a link there, and that will link you to all sorts of different standards, and you can find the ones that's probably most relevant to your discipline.
Yep. Okay. So if the audience has any more questions, feel free to send in and we will get them answered. And in the meanwhile, perhaps, Keith, you could share with us, in your work experience at the ARDC, what are some of the common challenges that the researchers face, in wanting to get their data to be reused more often and making it more accessible to everyone?
Yeah, so I think a few of the challenges that I've seen over the years, one of them is it comes back to that point about thinking right from the start about sharing your research data. And if you don't think about it right from the start, and if you don't design your consent forms in a way that others can actually get access to your data and use your data in appropriate ways, then actually sharing that data down the track will be much harder. So that's why right from the start, thinking about it and building that into consent forms is a very important aspect. Another aspect there is getting agreement amongst the different partners in the research project right from the start makes it much easier to understand which data will be shared at the end of the project and under which arrangements that will be shared. Other challenges in this space, I think what I often see is that researchers are not even aware of the support mechanisms that are in place at their own institution. So I always recommend have a chat internally, because you might well find there are actually support services at your own university that will be able to help you with this work and take some of the work out of your hands, so that it's not such an onerous task at the end of your project to share your data. So those are, I think, a few things that I've noticed recently, and we are really seeing an increasing shift as funders are starting to require more and more sharing of data, and also publishers are now requiring the sharing of data more and more strongly. There's more and more questions coming from researchers about how can this best be enabled, and how can you support me with this?
Yeah, thank you, Keith, for your advice. And it looks like we have covered all questions so far, but if the audience has any more, you all could just send it in and we'll have it answered and get it back to you. And before we end, Keith, is there anything more you'd like to add before we wrap up? Keith, you're on mute.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's the standard catchphrase in 2020. Yeah, you're on mute. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. It was great to be able to speak about this, about a subject that I care about quite a lot. And thank you to Hugh and Wiley for organising this. And I hope it's been useful and valuable. Thank you.
Alright, once again, thank you, Keith, for taking time to share your experiences, and a big thank you to the audience as well for joining us today. I hope you find this information useful. Have a good day ahead, and we will see you at our next webinar. Goodbye.